The Philadelphia Eagles are eventually going to have to replace Jason Peters. Who are they going to replace him with? Well, who knows? Maybe it's Jordan Mailata. Maybe it's somebody who's currently not on the roster. That's what Brett and Albert and I are here to discuss today. We got tackle rankings. We got interior offensive lineman rankings. We're going to get into it.
It's all about the big fellas and the guys who are wearing the numbers 50 through 70. We're not talking defensive line. We're talking about the offensive line, which in my opinion, Adrian, this is the most important position for the Eagles to address. And I say this, I've said it a couple different times, I would rather address offensive line too soon than too late. And I say that too because we know Carson Wentz isn't exactly Russell Wilson or Phillip Rivers, guys who've never missed a single game in their career. As of yet, he still has a little bit of an injury concern. Whether you like that statement or not, that's the fact. So to me, I'm addressing the offensive line soon. And in this draft class, Adrian, you and me are going to talk more in depth about this. There's a noticeable drop-off from the top guys to the bottom guys, especially at tackle.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you about it right now because it's something I'm curious about. I don't think any of the three are going to fall, but I'll ask you. So you can definitely tell there's a difference between Jonah Williams, Juwan Taylor, Cody Ford. Are any of those three going to be available for the Eagles at 25?
Not at 25. I mean, I think we're going to see Jonah Williams. I think he's the best guy. And then I think we'll see Taylor both go in the top 10. And then I don't think Cody Ford's going to get past Minnesota at 18. So this puts a tough situation on for the Eagles. If you want an offensive lineman, an elite level guy, you probably have to trade up for him. And I think that's the smartest move for the Eagles. If they want to make any movement, it's to trade up for an offensive lineman. It's not to trade up for a defensive lineman or a linebacker. I would recommend moving up for an offensive lineman. Why? Because you're about to pay the bank to Carson Wentz. And he does you no good if he's hurting on the bench. So let me build that wall in front of him.
And I also wanted to talk to you about the depth of this class. It's just not really there after those top three guys.
No, it's not. I mean, there's a couple tackles that you can say, okay, hey, he's a prospect, he's a project. That's all well and good. But to me, especially when we talk about tackles, I don't want prospects. I'd rather have prospects or project guys at receiver, guys who are really athletic. And I want well-rounded guys at tackle because you know what? If my receiver doesn't do his job and maybe he doesn't get open, all right, it's a bummer. It's incompletion. We don't move the change. If my tackle doesn't do his job, Carson Wentz is looking at a 300-pound man bearing down on him. I'm not cool with that. So I'd rather get the clear prospect in the offensive line and then go a little bit athletes at the receiver position later, Adrian.
I'm curious to see what they do at guard, too, because obviously you have the Brandon Brooks injury. He's going to miss maybe half the season, whatever it's going to be. With that Achilles, do you go guard maybe a little bit sooner than you normally would?
Or guard are both reasonable. And the other nice thing, too, is because of the way the Eagles play, it's a very movement-friendly offense. You can get a guy who can play guard, who can slide in to play center later because he's also going to be, a movement guy if Jason Kelce moves on, whether that's retirement or the Eagles move on for him. So I agree with you, Adrian. I think there's a big need at left tackle, obviously at the opposite guard spot from Brooks, and then, of course, for Brooks when he's missing, and then down the line, Jason Kelce. So there are a lot of question marks here for the long-term future of the Philadelphia Eagles and, more importantly, for the Carson Wentz's career.
Yeah. All right, let's get into the rankings now. Let's get into the tackles. My number one guy is Jonah Williams from Alabama. Lots of strength, lots of explosion, run blocker, pass blocker. He's dominant as either. Lots of physicality he plays with, always looking to finish. So he's my number one guy. I think it's pretty clear number one guy to me.
He's my clear number one guy. I mean, put it this way, folks. He came in as a freshman to Alabama and started at tackle. As a freshman, came in and started at tackle. Then he ended up moving because Cam Robinson was there, who ended up being a first-round pick. The Jacksonville Jaguars played the other tackle spot. So there's tons of versatility. He's a 3-year starter in the SEC. If you say 3-year starter in the SEC, I don't care what position he is. That tells me this guy is really, really talented. So I'm with you, Adrian. Jonah Williams is my number one. I hear the talk of he's got 33 and a quarter inch arms and he's 6'4", so maybe he's a little short. I don't care. If you can be productive in the SEC, I feel pretty darn confident you can be productive at tackle in the NFL.
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask that question. Do you think he's going to be good enough against power players? That's kind of the question that people have for him.
I do. I mean, look, I can only tell you one small snippet of time where he struggled, and that was against Cleveland Farrell and against Clemson. And you know what? He's going to end up being a first-round pick in the draft too. And that was only one game. So, Adrian, I don't have any concerns for him.
Yeah. All right. Number 2, my number 2. And I'll tell you what, this would be a perfect replacement for Jason Peters down the line if they go this route. Not sure if they would. Cody Ford. Dude's 330 pounds, and he kind of moves like a deer. His feet are ridiculously light for a guy that size. And you think about this scheme and the blocking scheme and the moving pieces and how much athleticism you need from the offensive lineman. I mean, this guy, Cody Ford, would be plug and play for the Birds. Well, not plug and play immediately, but plug and play once Jason Peters retires. I think he would be great for the Eagles. Now, I don't know if they would go this route because I don't know if he would be there at 25 or if they'd want to trade up. But you want to talk about a guy with a lot of change in direction, movement skills for a big man like that. It's Cody Ford, and he's my number 2.
I hear you, Adrian. He's my number 3. So let me tell you who my number 2 is. My number 2 is Jawan Taylor from Florida. Jawan Taylor is more of what you would think about when you think of the long tackle. He's more of a true right tackle here, but he is really good at dropping anchor and holding power. Bad news for Eagles fans, I think he's going to go in the top 10. A lot of people are saying there's a lot of smoke about him going to Jacksonville at 7, and that would make sense. But he's my number 2 tackle in this draft, Adrian.
And he's another guy. I mean, he's 320, he's 330. Another guy who's very light on his feet. So, I mean, there's not much differentiation for me from Ford and Taylor. A lot of more people are probably going to have Taylor over Ford, and that's okay. You know, I don't always have to agree. But a guy with a lot of power, 330, once he gets his hands on you, you're not getting off that block. So there it is. These top 3 guys, there's definitely a differentiation between these 3 and the next wave of tackles in this class. You pop the tape, you see it.
No doubt about it. So my number 3 guy, Adrian, is the one you talked about, is Cody Ford. And the reason I have Cody Ford a little bit later is only because of positional value. If you wanted to argue with me who's a better overall offensive lineman, Taylor or Ford, I'm willing to listen to that. I don't think there's a big discrepancy there. But Cody Ford is being talked about more as a guard. Now, he is a little bit smaller in length. Mm-hmm. So if you want to move him to guard, guess what? He still could be an all-pro guard for you down the line. I don't think Cody Ford's going to get past Minnesota at 18. All the conversations about the Vikings have been they want to get tougher, they want to get nastier on the inside of their offensive line. Cody Ford does that in spade. Plays with awesome balance here. Moves really well on the next level, and that's something that's a big staple of Oklahoma's offense. Cody Ford, as me and Adrian did a mock draft earlier, the Eagles, and I'm trading up. I'm trading up to get Cody Ford probably in the 15 range, which means I probably would have to trade a second and the first. But to me, I think that'd be worth it, Adrian, because he can come in, play at that guard spot, and then eventually could come over and replace tackle for Jason Peters if and when the time comes.
Yeah. All right, so number 4. Now, this is the point where you're just kind of throwing darts at the dartboard. Pick whoever. I got Yadni Kajust out of West Virginia, a big power guy. Now, my question is does he move well enough to play zone? So he might be only good for like a power scheme.
Yeah, Ronnie Kajust, I kind of would actually argue a little bit of the flip, Adrian. I would say he's not the most powerful blocker. That would be my knock on him. The other thing I would knock on him is there's a lot of plays where he didn't finish, right? I don't want to use the word soft because that's hard to say about a man whose professional career is to smash his head against another man. But he unfortunately did have an ACL injury during the training process. So he's a guy who's sliding right now. And when his knock was maybe he's not the best finisher, that's why I don't have him in my top 5. But Yadni Kajust from West Virginia, I certainly understand where you're coming from there, Adrian, with him. My number 4 guy is Andre Dillard. And it's funny because as I'm talking about Kajust's negatives, I can apply the same thing here for Andre Dillard. Andre Dillard coming out of Washington State, his big thing is he's not a great run blocker. Flip side, might be the most athletic tackle in this draft, true left tackle, great in pass protection. And my argument I would make to those folks who say he's not good in run blocking, well, if I told you 80% of the job you're going to do option A, you're probably going to be bad at option B if you're only spending 20% of the time working on it. That's West Virginia. That's Washington State's offense. Yeah. All pass, no run. So I understand why people are going to say he's soft in the run game. I also would point to the fact he hasn't had a lot of opportunity to really perfect it.
I was talking to a draft guy about him actually, and he was kind of saying like he's got a lot of athleticism, just a wonderful athlete. But when you watch the tape, it's like he was a little bit worried about it.
I mean, here's the
I don't
thing.
know what he meant by that.
I mean, the thing that I think people need to remember too is the NFL circles can like a player more than college circles can like them,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and again, because you play left tackle, you're instantly going to get drafted higher than you probably should. Teams like the Carolina Panthers, the Houston Texans, the Seattle Seahawks, these are all teams who have massive needs for left tackle position. I don't see him sliding out of the first round because of that, Adrian.
All right, let me ask you a question. Do you see Dalton Risner as a tackle or a guard? Because
I see him as a right tackle or a guard. He's definitely not a left tackle, but he's my number 5 guy, Adrian.
Okay, all right. So he's all right because I put him as a tackle, and he's my number 5 guy.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that. I think he's a little stiff. If I were to be a little negative, I think
which is why he might be a guard.
Correct, which is why you might say, you know what, let's get you more inside where we can get the pressure on you earlier. But this is a tough son of a bitch.
Yeah.
I mean, when you go put on the Senior Bowl tape, him and John Gruden were going back and forth, just playfully jawing at each other, and he's mixing it up with all the defensive linemen. He's one of those guys where you bring him in, and if you imagine you close your eyes like a bouncer at a nightclub, that guy looking for trouble, that's Dalton Risner. And I think he's a guy, Adrian, that we could see go from 20 to 40. He could be a fit for the Eagles if they don't trade up, but I don't see him at tackle. I just see him at guard.
Yeah, my question with him would be how he would handle the speed guy. I don't know if he's got the flexibility for it to handle those big speed rushers on coming from the edge.
That's a fair concern. And for those people who have that concern, they would say, well, you know what? What's he best at? He's best at being physical and a nasty SOB. Then put him at right guard where he can do those things.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a good point. All right, so now we get to the interior offensive lineman rankings. I guess we don't really have to focus on this as much, but we'll run down some names. So my number 1 guy here is Chris Lindstrom out of Boston College. Explosive, powerful, pulled a lot in Boston College's power scheme, and I like the way he looked. So I'm going to put him as my number 1 guy.
I hear you, Adrian. I have him a little bit later. Now, I will say this too. If you asked me, guys, when I did my inside guys, I also put Jonah Williams and I put Ford in here because I think both of those guys, as well as Risner, could instantly come in and be starters at guard, okay? Yeah. So let's not talk about them because those guys would be in my top 3.
Yeah.
The next guy I have here is I have Garrett Bradley, center from NC State. If you want to talk about big men who are light on your feet, Garrett Bradley has that in spade. He reminds me a lot of Jason Kelce in terms of his ability to go and get guys to the next level, but he's also 6'3", 300 pounds. So he checks all of the boxes here. I think he's a guy who's probably going to go in that late first. I could see the Baltimore Ravens, and to tell you what, his very worst case scenario is the Kansas City Chiefs in the first round.
Yeah. Okay. So he's actually my number 3. My number 2 is Michael Dieter out of Wisconsin. Flexible, athletic a little bit. He's got some power, got a little bit of everything. So he's my number 2 out of Wisconsin.
You got to put a Wisconsin guy on the offensive line every year, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You got to do it. Chris Lindstrom is my number 2, Adrian.
Okay.
Chris Lindstrom is a guy that I think will excel if you run a zone blocking scheme. If you're a power team, think Seattle, think Baltimore. No, that's not going to be him. So he's very, very light on his feet, but he lacks a lot of the instant physicality. But athletically, he's going to do a great job at getting in front and at least being able to hold the point of a contact. But he's not the guy who's going to blow people off. That's why I have him at number 2, Adrian.
Garrett Bradbury, my number 3. And you kind of took the words right out of my mouth about the Jason Kelce comparison. So one of the things that Kelce does really well is the reach block. And one of the things that popped down on tape immediately about Garrett Bradbury was his ability to reach block. Very quick, very nimble, flexibility for days. That's why he's my number 3. Really light on his feet. You already talked about it.
I hear you there for all of that. Now, my number 3 is Michael Dieter, who we're kind of flip-flopping a little bit here. Which is great.
We basically have the same – we have the same 3, but just different rankings.
Yeah, what's interesting about him is from a guard, he's 6'6", which is not something you normally think about for guys who are guards. You're usually thinking the guys who are 6'3", and once you really pass 6'4", all of a sudden you're going out and play tackle. My biggest concern with him is he's a guy that when the lights were shining the brightest, when he played Ohio State worked him pretty good. Now I get it. Ohio State is going to have their way more often than not, but that was his big shining moment. And I don't think he's elite in terms of power. I think he's really good. He's really good mobility, like you talked about, Adrian. But I would like to see a little more power, especially when we're moving guys. I think Chris Lindstrom and him have similar pros and cons, though.
Mm-hmm. Number 4, Eric McCoy out of Texas A&M. Moves people on his down blocks. That's the one thing I saw immediately. It's a lot of push.
A lot of push. I got to bring centers in because center is just such an important position. So Elton Jenkins is my next guy. He's my number 4 from Mississippi State. Elton Jenkins, I think he's one of those guys where he's very solid at everything he does. I don't think he's a guy who I'm going to say, like, this guy's going to be an all-pro in 5 years, but he's really solid. The only thing, and this is what's funny about him, his biggest negative when I was listening to Daniel Jeremiah and I was kind of learning more, and that's what I'm trying to do. We're always trying to learn from some of the best guys.
Yeah.
DJ's biggest knock on him was snap consistency. So he said, well, he could go play guard. And my first thought was, well, if the center's biggest problem is snap consistency, that's like saying the quarterback can't hit the 5-yard hitch or the receiver can't catch. It's kind of part of their job. So I understand like why some people are really into him, but if there's a notion out there that his snap consistency is a concern, maybe this guy's not all he's cracked up to be. But when you're a center, just like when you're a left tackle, you're very, very important to the offensive line.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You got to be able to snap the ball. Especially now with all the shotgun in place and the pistol offense, you're not just going under center anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, my number 5, Drew Samia out of Oklahoma. You want to talk about a junkyard dog? That's Drew Samia.
I hear you. Eric McCoy is my number 5 guy here for Texas A&M. Adrian, you talked a lot about him already. You're right. A lot of movement for him. The biggest concern I have is in pass protection. Doesn't do a great job of dropping anchor. Get pushed a little too far back, which to me as an interior lineman, that's a major red flag for me because that's where we're seeing more and more guys, more and more teams are trying to get pressure in the A and B gaps. And if you are getting put on skates, that's a concern for me. Mm-hmm. This is a guy, Adrian, I probably see being 2nd, 3rd round, but really we see a big drop off after, the big 3 like I talked about.
That point there kind of makes me think of this, and I'll ask you this question. Are guards more important now than they have been because of all these interior linemen who are rushing the quarterback?
I think honestly, Adrian, offensive line period is more important than it's ever been because I talked on my podcast. I had a guy named Tyree St. Louis from the University of Miami on my podcast who played left and right tackle, and I asked him about that, and he said, we would line up against Florida State, and they would move Brian Burns around like pre-snap. So we would be prepared for the left tackle being the pass rush guy, and all of a sudden we get the best pass rush guy on the right side. And he's 100% right, So I believe, Adrian, the offensive line has never been more important than it is now because we're seeing teams getting so freaking complex with their defensive line that there's no such thing as a weak guy to rush the passer.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, anything else? I'm trying to think. I don't think anything else is on the agenda. I don't have any more questions for you.
I think the only other thing I would say for Eagles fans, like if you don't get an offensive lineman in the first 2 rounds, it's really rough. I talked about this in the receiver show. There's a lot of depth at receiver where I would feel pretty darn good about the Eagles getting a receiver in the 4th round who potentially could be a starter, if nothing else, a role player in the 4th round. I don't think you're going to get a guy who can start even in 3 years in the 4th round from this year's offensive line class. If you want to get a starter in the next 3 years for your Philadelphia Eagles, I would strongly encourage you to do it in the 1st or 2nd round.
Actually, I do have a question for you because there's a guy that Jeff Stoutland is apparently pounding the table for. So I'll ask you about Titus Howard. Do you know about Titus Howard? What can you tell me?
Alabama State, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Howard's got a really cool story. Came into Alabama State as a quarterback, then moved to tight end, then moved to tackle.
Little Jason Peters comparison there.
That's fair. So it's one of those things, Adrian, where his window for growth is obviously very high, but it's also because he's no experience with that. Now, here's the one thing I'll say. You have the best offensive line coaches in the world. There's 32 best offensive line coaches in the world, and they're all employed by NFL teams. So
Yes.
obviously, when he goes to the league, he's going to get the best coaching he's ever gotten in his career. So he obviously can grow. He would be a guy, Adrian, I would take in the 4th round, 5th round, if Tyrese Howard out of Alabama State. But again, he's not a finished product. So if you think you're drafting him and he's going to start for you year 1, you might as well just start sending your quarterback get well soon cards.
Well, this is why you draft them and you develop them. And when Jason Peters retires, maybe that's when you plug them in. But it seems like that's what the Eagles kind of want. They want these raw projects that they can potentially develop, just like they did with Jordan Mailata last year.
I get that. I understand that. But I also would say, who's your best offensive lineman right now? I would say it's Lane Johnson. Where was he drafted? The 1st round. Okay.
Yeah.
So my belief is, again, with the offensive line, I don't want projects. I'll take projects at the receiver position, at defensive back, at running back. I'm not taking it at the offensive line because the offensive line is the only position. If they don't do their job, I can seriously get one of my teammates hurt.
I wonder if there was a more pressing need at tackle, if they'd approach it a little bit differently than try to go after the projects.
I mean, I'm someone who's not a big believer in going after projects. And
You
I think
just don't believe it, period.
No, I don't believe period in it.
Yes.
So I am more of a believer in you need to do this. I mean, look, the Indianapolis Colts tried that for years, and Andrew Luck is just barely getting it right now. I'm not saying the Eagles are doing that, but I'm saying there's a lot of case examples that are teams that, draft heavy in the offensive line and then just figure it out on the outsides later. I mean, look, you got Golden Tate for a 5th round pick. No shit. Like, yeah, I'd rather do that than, say, take a 5th round flyer on an offensive lineman that might project to something.
Yeah. All right, that was a nice little conversation there to end the show. So that's it now. I forgot to plug your podcast in the beginning. I'm sorry. So tell us. I always forget each and every time. Tell us where we can find your podcast, Brendan.
Yeah, so you guys can find my podcast at Burton TV. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Apple Music. Got a whole bunch of good guests in the past. As I mentioned, Tyree St. Louis from the University of Miami, tackle prospect coming out this year. Connor Rogers of Bleacher Report. And then also Mello Miller of Bleacher Report as well. He'll be joining me tonight on my podcast. So really encourage you guys to check it out if you enjoy listening to me.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely check it out. I'll be checking it out. I love your podcast.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's Brendan Albert. I'm Adrian Fedke. And I'm even sending you questions for the podcast tonight, too. So there it is.
Sounds good, guys.
Yeah. We're out. Peace.
Hey, guys.